"Get off my land." Gideon Voss didn't shout it. He said it quietly, the way a man says something he's already decided and doesn't need anyone's agreement on. He was standing in the barn doorway with a lantern in one hand and his thumb hooked into his belt with the other, and his eyes were flat and cold in a way that made the temperature drop another 5 degrees. Mara Bellamy was kneeling in the dirt beside a man she'd never met in her life. The stranger was barely breathing, his arm bent wrong below the elbow. There was blood caked into the lines of his face like dark mud, and he smelled of road dust and old sweat and something metallic she didn't want to think too hard about. She had already torn a strip from the bottom of her own flannel shirt. She was wrapping his forearm. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not. "He'll die out here," she said. She didn't look up. "Then he dies," Gideon said. "That ain't my problem." If you were in Mara's place that night, 17 years old, no family, no safety net, nothing but a job on a man's ranch that you've worked yourself half to death to keep, what would you do? Before you answer, stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. If this is your first time here, welcome. I tell stories about real courage, real consequences, and the moments that define who we are when nobody's watching. If that sounds like something you need more of, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss one. And when you finish today's story, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Let's begin. Part 1. Mara had come to Iron Creek Ranch when she was 12 years old. Didn't come looking for charity. She came because the woman who ran the town's dry goods store, a widow named Elspeth Carey, had spotted her sleeping under the loading dock behind the feed barn and had said, not unkindly, that she couldn't have a child living behind a building she owned because it made her look like she wasn't paying attention. Elspeth had loaded her into a wagon, driven her out to the ranch, and told Gideon Voss that here was a girl who knew how to work and wasn't afraid of it. Gideon had looked her up and down the way you'd look at a horse you were considering, but weren't convinced you needed. "You know how to muck stalls," he'd said. "Yes, sir." "You know how to haul water?" "Yes, sir." "You gonna cry when things get hard?" Mara had looked him straight in the eye. "No, sir." He'd nodded once, and that was that. She slept in the corner of the bunkhouse closest to the wall, where the wind came through a gap in the boards in winter. She ate what the hands ate. She worked before anyone else woke up, and she was still working when the others quit for the night. She didn't do it to be noticed. She did it because work was the only thing she had that felt solid, and she'd learned early on that you don't waste the things you have. Her grandfather, Sergeant Elias Bellamy, had taught her that. He'd taught her a lot of things, most of them the hard way, before he'd gotten sick and died when she was 9 and left her completely alone in the world. He used to say that a person's true character only shows up when doing the right thing costs you something real. It was easy to be decent when nothing was on the line. The test came when you had to pay. She thought about that a lot out there on Iron Creek Ranch. She thought about it the night she found the stranger by the water trough. It was late October, and the valley had been in the grip of a drought that had been grinding the life out of everything for going on 3 years. The cattle were lean. The wells were running low. Gideon had gotten meaner as things got worse, which was saying something, because Gideon had never been what you'd call a gentleman. He wasn't cruel for sport, exactly. He wasn't the kind of man who hurt things just to feel something, but he ran the ranch on the principle that weakness was a kind of theft. And he had very little patience for anyone who couldn't pull their weight. Mara understood that. She even respected it in her own way. What she had never been able to respect was how he looked at other people's suffering like it was their own fault. She'd gone out to check on a mare that had been restless all evening, worried the animal might be running a fever. The night was cold enough to make her breath show, and the ground was frozen solid, and the yard was completely still under a sky full of hard white stars. She was halfway across the yard when she nearly tripped over him. He was lying curled on his side next to the water trough, and for one terrible second she thought he was dead. Then she heard him breathing. It was a wet, ragged sound like air moving through a broken bellows. She crouched down next to him, and what she saw made her stomach close up tight. His right arm was bent at an angle that arms don't bend. There was a cut across his forehead that had bled down over one side of his face and dried into a dark mask. His lips were cracked and split. He was shaking so hard she could see it even in the dim starlight, and his skin. When she pressed two fingers against the side of his throat to feel for his pulse, cold in a way that frightened her. "Hey," she said. "Hey, can you hear me?" He made a sound that might have been a word and might have been nothing. "I've got you," she said, which was a strange thing to say to a full-grown man she'd never laid eyes on, but it came out before she could stop it. "Just stay still, don't move," she ran for the bunkhouse. Brock Tolland was awake when she came through the door, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a deck of cards he was laying out for some kind of solitaire game. Brock was Gideon's foreman, a wide-shouldered man with small, quick eyes and the kind of smile that never quite made it all the way to friendly. He looked at her for a long moment when she came in breathing hard, not moving, not saying anything. "There's a man hurt by the water trough," she said. "Bad hurt, broken arm, head wound. He needs help right now." Brock set a card down, turned it over Drifter. "I don't know who he is." "He's half dead is what he is. Not our business," Brock said. "He's going to die." "People die," Brock said, in the tone of someone observing that rain is wet. She stared at him for a second, and then she turned around and went to Gideon's house. She knocked. She wasn't supposed to knock on that door past 9 o'clock at night. She knocked anyway. Gideon came to the door in his long underwear holding a lantern, and his expression when he saw her told her immediately that this was not going to go the way she needed it to. But she told him what she'd found, told him quick and plain without any extra words, and she watched his face while she talked. He didn't get upset, he didn't get scared, he just got tired. "Leave him," he said. "He'll die, Mara." He said her name like it was the end of a sentence. "We are fighting to keep this ranch alive through the driest year in 20 years. I don't have water to spare on a stranger. I don't have medicine to spare. I don't have time to spare chasing trouble that came riding in on somebody else's back. You leave him where he is, and in the morning, if he's still breathing, we'll figure out what to do. But you don't touch what I haven't told you to touch." He started to close the door. "What if that were you lying out there?" she said. He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something that moved across his face, she saw it. She would always wonder about it afterward, but it was gone as fast as it came. And when he spoke again, his voice was the same flat, tired voice. "It's not me," he said. "Go to bed." The door closed. She stood on the porch steps for a moment. The night pressed in around her. Cold pressed in. She could hear, or thought she could hear, that wet, broken breathing from somewhere across the yard. Her grandfather used to tell a story about a winter battle, about soldiers left behind when it got too dangerous to hold the line, about the choice between following the order to retreat and staying with the men who couldn't move on their own. He told it without making himself the hero of it. He told it like it was just a thing that happened, and he happened to be there, and the choice he'd made hadn't been complicated because he hadn't understood at the time just how close it all came to killing him too. Mara understood it now. She went back to the water trough. She did it slowly because she was thinking through every step. She gathered what she could without making a trip into Gideon's house or the locked supply room, her own canteen, which she'd filled that evening and hadn't drunk from yet, a length of clean cloth from the mending pile in the bunkhouse, taken quietly while Brock was still playing his card game, 2 straight sticks from the woodpile that would do for a splint, and a small tin of salve she kept in her own bag for the cracks that formed on her hands in cold weather. It wasn't much, it was what she had. She knelt in the frozen dirt next to the stranger, and she worked by starlight because she was afraid to light a lantern where Gideon might see it from the house. She cleaned the wound on his forehead, which was deep but not deep enough to show bone, and she pressed the cloth against it and held it there until the bleeding slowed. She got her canteen open and tilted a little water between his cracked lips. Not too much, just enough to wet his throat, and she watched him swallow it with what looked like enormous effort. "That's it," she said quietly. "Just drink a little. Don't rush it." His eyes opened. They were darker than she expected, and clearer than she expected given everything. He looked at her like a man trying to understand where he was and what was in front of him, running the calculations, sorting through what was real. "Easy," she said. His voice came out broken, scraped raw. "Doesn't matter. Don't talk yet." She went to work on his arm. It was the hardest part. She'd helped set a horse's leg once, years ago, and the principle wasn't entirely different. But a horse couldn't look at you while you were doing it. He made a sound she tried not to think about when she brought the bones into alignment, and his whole body went rigid, and she felt him fighting down something, a scream or unconsciousness. She couldn't tell which. His free hand closed around her wrist, not grabbing, not hard, just holding on. She talked to him the whole time. She didn't say anything important. She said things like, "Keep breathing," and "almost done and you're going to be all right," even though she didn't know if that last part was true. She said them anyway, because they were the things you said, and sometimes the thing a person most needs to hear is just another voice in the dark, telling them they're not alone. She was halfway through tying off the splint when she heard the barn door. Light fell across the yard lantern light. Orange and wavering, and Gideon's boots crunched on the frozen ground, and behind him she heard Brock's slower, heavier footsteps. She didn't stop what she was doing. She tied the last knot and moved so that she was between the lantern and the stranger's face. Gideon stopped a few feet away. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at Mara. He looked at the cloth, the canteen, the makeshift splint, and everything it represented. "Get off him," he said. "I'm almost done." I said, "Get off." He would have died, Gideon. She stood up then, faced him. "You know he would have died." "And that," Gideon said, very slowly and very clearly, as if she were having trouble with the language, "is not my concern. I told you to leave him. You disobeyed a direct order on my land, using my supplies. My supplies, my canteen, my cloth. On my land," he finished, and his voice dropped to something very quiet and very cold. "I have been patient with you, Mara, long past what most men would have been. But I will not have someone who works for me making decisions I've already made for her. You think you know better than me?" His eyes moved to Brock for just a second. "She thinks she knows better than me." Brock said nothing. He was watching Mara with those small, quick eyes, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. "I saved a man's life," Mara said. "That's all I did." "You defied me on my own property." Gideon's jaw tightened. "You want to play the Good Samaritan. You find somewhere else to do it. You're done here." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I want you gone before sunup. You take what fits in one bag and you leave what doesn't. And if I find anything missing, I'll have Brock ride after you." He turned and walked back to the house. Brock lingered for a moment. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at Mara. Something moved in his face that she couldn't read. Then he turned and followed Gideon. The lantern light retreated. The yard went dark again. Mara stood alone in the frozen starlight with a dying stranger and everything she'd just lost. She looked down at the man on the ground. He was still conscious. His eyes were open, tracking her. He'd heard everything. She could see it in his face, not pity, which would have been easier to take something quieter and heavier than that. "You should have let me alone," he said. His voice was a little stronger than before. "A little." "No," Mara said. "I shouldn't have." She sat down next to him to keep him warm until morning. She didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the water trough and her knees pulled to her chest, and she listened to him breathe, and she watched the stars move, and she thought about her grandfather's voice telling her that the test only comes when you have to pay. And she thought about what it meant that she didn't regret it, not even a little, even though she'd just traded her bed and her wages and her roof over her head for a stranger in the dirt. She was 17 years old. She owned one canvas bag, 3 changes of clothes, a worn pair of boots, and a silver locket with a photograph inside it that she would not have traded for anything Gideon Voss had ever owned. When the first gray light started building in the east, she stood up, went to the bunkhouse, and packed her bag in the dark. She rolled her blanket tight. She put on every layer she owned. She pulled the locket out from under her shirt and held it for a moment, her thumb moving over the engraved surface. When she came back out, the stranger was gone, just gone. The ground where he'd been lying still showed the pressed shape of him, and there was a little dried blood on the frost at the edge of the trough. But the man himself had vanished in the early dark as completely as if he'd never been there at all. She stood and looked at the empty space for a long time. Then she picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the gate. Brock was already there. He was leaning against the post with his arms crossed and that almost smile on his face, and he watched her come like he'd been waiting for this specifically. Behind him, a couple of the morning hands were drifting around the yard, pretending not to watch. "End of the line," Brock said. "Get out of my way, Brock." He stepped aside, but slowly, making her wait for it, making her walk close enough to him that she could smell the coffee on his breath. As she passed, he said quietly, just for her, "Good luck out there, girl. That walk to Copper Ridge is long and it's hot, and there ain't much water between here and there. You might want to think hard about whether you want to go back in there and apologize to Gideon before that gate closes behind you." She didn't look at him. She walked through the gate. She heard it creak and latch behind her, and then she heard Brock say something to someone, and a couple of the hands laughed. And then the yard sounds faded behind her, and the road opened up ahead, and she was walking, and there was nothing left to do but keep going. The sun came up slow and pale. By mid-morning it was hot, that flat, relentless heat that the drought had baked into the whole valley, the kind that came off the road surface in visible waves and made the distant hills look like they were breathing. She had one canteen. She had some dried meat wrapped in cloth. She had about 2 days of walking ahead of her, and no particular certainty that Copper Ridge would have anything for her when she got there. She had done everything right by her own measure, and it had cost her everything she had. She thought that ought to bother her more than it did. She kept walking. She was 3 hours out from the ranch when she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw them, 2 horses moving fast enough to raise dust, coming from the direction of Iron Creek Ranch. Not the lazy drifting sound of men riding out to check fences or move cattle. These horses were being pushed. She could tell by the rhythm of it, that hard, deliberate drumming that meant someone had a destination and was in a hurry to get there. She didn't stop walking. She thought about it. She thought about stepping off the road, finding a rock formation or a dry creek bed to duck into, waiting them out. The valley was wide and open, and the road ran straight as a fence line for a long stretch in either direction, so the odds of hiding were not good. And besides, she told herself she had done nothing wrong. She was a person walking down a public road with her own belongings in her own bag, and nobody had any business interfering with that. She believed that. She kept her eyes forward and kept walking and listened to the hoofbeats get louder. They came up on her fast and swung around to cut her off, one horse pulling up just ahead of her and the other coming alongside, so that she had to stop or walk into them. She stopped. She looked up. Brock Tolland was in the saddle of the lead horse, and his expression had changed from the almost smile she was used to seeing. What was on his face now was something more purposeful and less pleasant. Beside him was a hand named Dell Young, thick through the shoulders, not especially smart, the kind of person who does what he's told because it's easier than having an opinion. "Gideon sent us," Brock said, "I figured. Says he thinks you might have taken something on your way out." She felt the cold land in her chest, but she kept her face still. "I took what was mine, nothing else, well." Brock swung down from his horse. Landed heavy, raising a little puff of dust. "Gideon figures we ought to verify that." "No." He looked at her. "No? You heard me." Something shifted in his expression. She'd seen that look before on Brock and on men like him, the moment when inconvenience tips into something uglier. He'd been hoping she'd argue, she realized. Had been counting on it, even. It gave him somewhere to go. This doesn't have to be difficult, he said. It's already difficult, Mara said. Gideon fired me this morning. Whatever legal authority you have over me ended when he closed that gate. I'm not on his land. You've got no right to search me. Brock took a step toward her. You got a real mouth on you, he said. Always have. Step back, Brock. He didn't step back. He moved faster than she expected, for a man his size not running, just closing the distance in 2 quick strides, and his hand shot out and caught her by the canvas strap of her bag. She pulled against it, instinctively, and he yanked hard, and the strap bit into her shoulder and then snapped, and the bag went sideways, hit the road surface, and everything inside it scattered. Her spare shirt, her wrapped meat, her grandfather's Bible with the cracked spine, her mending kit, the folded letter from Elspeth Carey with an address in Copper Ridge written on it. Everything she owned, spread across the dust of a road in the middle of nowhere. She dropped to her knees to gather it. Brock's boot came down on the Bible. The locket, he said. She looked up at him. I know you've got it on you, he said. I've seen you wearing it for 5 years. Silver locket, old style, fits in the palm of your hand. He tilted his head. Gideon says it belongs to the ranch. Says your grandfather sold it to him years ago as part of a debt. That is a lie, Mara said. The words came out quiet and very flat. That's what he says. My grandfather never set foot on Iron Creek Ranch. He died when I was 9 years old. He had never heard of Gideon Voss. She straightened up slowly. That locket was my grandfather's. He left it to me. It is the only thing he left me, and Gideon Voss is a liar. Brock shrugged. Maybe. But you're a 17-year-old girl standing on a road by herself, and I'm the foreman of the biggest ranch in this valley. And I've got a man with me, and you've got nobody. So why don't we put aside who's right and who's lying, and you just hand over the locket, and Dell and I ride back, and you walk on to Copper Ridge, and we never bother each other again. She looked at him for a long moment. She could feel the locket against her sternum, warm from her skin, that familiar small weight she'd stopped noticing years ago because it had just become part of her. She thought about her grandfather's photograph inside it, the only photograph that existed of him, as far as she knew. The only proof that he had looked like something, had been a real man with a real face, had existed in the world before she existed in it. No, she said. Brock exhaled through his nose. Dell, he said. Dell came off his horse. She turned to run. She got maybe 4 steps before Brock caught her by the arm, not her bag this time. Her actual arm, fingers wrapped hard around her elbow and spun her back. She lost her footing on the uneven road surface and went down on one knee, and the impact sent a hard jolt up through her leg, and she bit down on the sound that tried to come out of her. Don't make me hurt you, Brock said, and his voice had gone quieter, which was worse. I'm serious, Mara. I don't want to do that. Just give me the locket. Let go of my arm. Give me the locket. The rifle shot was so loud and so sudden, so close that every thought she'd been having simply ceased. Brock's hand dropped off her arm as if she'd gone electrified. The horses shied and danced. Dell made a sound somewhere between a curse and a yell and stumbled back toward his horse and grabbed the bridle to steady the animal. The sound rolled out across the valley, bouncing off the distant rock faces, and then the echo faded and the valley was absolutely still. Mara looked up. The dust was settling in from the east, from the direction she'd been walking toward, and through it she counted horses. 1, 2, 3, then more shapes resolving behind them. Riders total, arranged in a loose formation that looked completely casual and was, she understood immediately, not casual at all. They were positioned, deliberately, the way men positioned themselves when they were professionally accustomed to positioning themselves and wanted the other party to understand this without anyone having to say it. The rider in front was dressed in black, not working black, not the faded, worn, functional black of a ranch hand's coat. This was something else, a long coat that had been expensive when it was made and was still expensive now, slightly road dusty but unmistakably well cut. The horse beneath him was a dark bay that moved like it had been chosen and trained by someone with money and patience. He was holding a rifle loosely across his lap, not raised. Just there, visible its own complete statement. He looked down at Brock. Brock looked up at him. For about 4 seconds, nobody said anything. Then the man in black said, "Take your hands off her." His voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had learned that volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be obeyed. Brock said, "This is a private matter between—" "I watched you knock her down," the man said. "That makes it my matter. Take your hands off her and step back." Brock took his hands off her and stepped back. Mara got to her feet. Her knee was already stiffening, and she didn't let herself limp. She looked up at the rider in the black coat. She recognized the voice first. It was a second before she recognized the face, partly because the face was cleaner than it had been the last time she'd seen it, and partly because the last time she'd seen it, it had been pressed sideways against frozen dirt with blood masking half of it. But she recognized the voice, and then her brain caught up, and she stood there in the road with her scattered belongings around her feet and the sun beating down on her shoulders, and she understood what she was looking at. The drifter, the broken-armed, half-dead drifter she'd knelt beside in the freezing dark, who'd disappeared before sunup, who she'd assumed had either recovered enough to wander off on his own or had died somewhere she couldn't see. He was on a $1,500 horse. He was wearing a coat that cost more than she'd earned in the last 2 years combined. He had 6 armed riders behind him. She heard her own voice come out of her mouth. "What?" "I'll explain everything," he said. "But first," he looked at Brock again. "Pick up her things." Brock's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said. "She didn't scatter them," the man said. "You did." "Pick them up." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Brock was a big man, a proud man, a man who had spent years being the most dangerous person in most rooms he entered. Every visible muscle in his face and neck was communicating that he did not pick things up off the ground for people. One of the riders behind the man in black shifted in his saddle. Just shifted, didn't do anything, just moved. Brock looked at the scattered belongings on the road. He looked at the rider in black. He looked at the 6 men behind him. He bent down and picked up Mara's things. He didn't look at her while he did it. He kept his eyes down, which was the only mercy he had available to offer, and he gathered what he could reach and piled it roughly near her feet, and he stood back up, and he still didn't look at her. "Dell," Brock said, and his voice was careful and flat. "We're done here." Dell was already on his horse. Brock mounted up, and the 2 of them turned back toward Iron Creek Ranch without another word, moving at a walk because running would have required admitting something they were not prepared to admit. Mara watched them go. Then she crouched down and finished gathering her things, working slowly because her hands were shaking a little, and she focused on each item as she replaced it in the bag, checking it over, taking inventory. The Bible was undamaged. The letter from Elspeth was still folded and readable. Everything was there. She worked the broken strap as best she could, looped it through the buckle in a way that would hold for a while if she was careful. When she stood up, the rider in black had dismounted and was standing a few feet away. On the ground, he was taller than she'd thought, or maybe just seemed that way without the frozen dirt as a reference point. His arm, the right arm she'd splinted in the dark, was in a proper sling now, the kind a doctor had put together, clean linen and a real knot. He moved it carefully, keeping it close to his body. He was watching her in a way that made her feel like she was being assessed. Not rudely, but seriously, the way you assess something you are trying to understand and not doing it quite quickly enough. "You left," she said. "Before sunrise, I did. I thought you were dead." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that. I couldn't stay, and I didn't have a way to tell you that wouldn't make things more complicated than they already were." She looked at him. "More complicated than them already were," she repeated. "You were passed out in the dirt. Yes, I'd just lost my job." I know that too, and you're saying it was complicated for you. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, more like the edge of one, the kind that acknowledges a point without entirely conceding to it. I'm saying I should have found a way to tell you. And I'm sorry I didn't. She looked past him at the 6 riders sitting on their horses with the practiced stillness of men who were paid to wait. Who are you? He said. My name is Rowan Mercer. The name meant nothing to her. She said so. No reason it would, he said. Not out here. I own a railroad company and a cattle operation out of the Eastern Territories, and I have some land interests through the Valley Corridor. He paused. Iron Creek Ranch is one of the properties I have an interest in. She stared at him. He went on carefully, like a man placing weight on ice he isn't sure about. I've been aware for some months that cattle belonging to my company have been going missing near this valley. Not strays, significant numbers, systematic losses, the kind that don't happen by accident. I came to Red Hollow to look into it personally, and I came quietly because I've found that when people know who I am, things have a way of becoming arranged before I can see them as they actually are. You came as a drifter, she said. I came as a traveler who wasn't advertising his business. That's the same thing. Fair, he said. She was putting it together now, slowly, the pieces falling into place in a way that was making her chest feel tight. Gideon, she said. Rowan nodded once. He's stealing your cattle. He has been stealing from my company's holdings for approximately 14 months, Rowan said. His men found me 2 nights ago when I was getting close to their holding pens. I was not handled gently, an understatement, she thought, remembering the angle of his arm and the blood on his face. They left you to die. They assumed I would, he said. I probably would have. She looked at her hands, then looked back at him. And now, he said, I'd like to offer you a ride to Copper Ridge, if you'll accept it. And along the way, I'd like to talk to you about some things. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the riders. She looked at the expensive horse. She looked at the man in front of her, who she had knelt beside in the frozen dark, and who had disappeared like smoke before morning, and who had apparently spent that time putting on a completely different life and riding back to find her. I'm not interested in charity, she said. I know, he said. I don't need saving. I can see that, he said, and his eyes moved briefly to the road where Brock had been standing, and then back to her. You were handling it. I was. Yes. She hitched her bag over her shoulder, feeling the strap hold. You can explain on the way, she said, but I want the whole story, not pieces of it. I'm done with people deciding for me what I need to know. All right, he said. She walked to the horses. One of his men, a weathered, straight-backed man in his 50s, with the eyes of someone who had seen most of what the world could throw at a person and remained largely unimpressed, moved his horse sideways and offered her a hand up onto a spare mount. She took the hand and swung up, settling into the saddle with the practice of someone who'd been on horseback since she was old enough to reach a stirrup. The riders fell in around her. Rowan mounted on her left, managing the reins with his one good hand, with a competence that suggested he'd been riding long enough that the arm barely mattered to the muscle memory. He caught her looking and didn't explain it or apologize for it, which she respected. They rode. For a while. Neither of them spoke, and the valley moved past them at a walking pace, the dry hills and the pale sky and the road stretching toward Copper Ridge in the far distance. The sun was high and fierce now, and the ground shimmered at the edges of her vision, and she felt the accumulated weight of the night no sleep, the cold, the kneeling in frozen dirt, the morning's confrontation settling into her bones like water into dry soil. Start talking, she said. He did. He told her about the cattle losses not in vague terms, but specifically numbers and dates and which pasture boundaries they'd been disappearing from. He told her about the investigation his company had been running for months through intermediaries, and how the intermediaries had come back with consistent evidence pointing to this valley, Iron Creek Ranch, but nothing clean enough to act on directly. He told her he'd decided to come himself and look with his own eyes. You didn't send a lawyer, she said. or a marshal. I send lawyers and marshals when I have evidence, he said. I came to find it. That was not a smart decision. No, he said. It wasn't. You almost died, I'm aware. For cattle. He was quiet for a moment. For the principle of it, he said, and she heard in his voice something that was not quite the thing a rich man says when he's talking about protecting his assets. Something slightly different from that. My father built that cattle operation from nothing over 30 years, and he did it honestly. Every animal accounted for, every worker paid what was owed, every debt settled. When someone steals from what he built, it isn't just a financial problem for me. She didn't say anything to that. She thought she understood it, actually. The thing about something being more than the sum of its material parts. Gideon is in debt, she said, has been for years. I know. I have his financial records. My attorneys found them as part of the investigation. He borrowed against the land 3 years ago when the drought started, and he's been unable to service the debt since. He's been keeping the ranch alive on what he's stolen from my herds. So he's desperate. He is. That doesn't make it right, she said. No, Rowan said, it doesn't. They rode in silence for a while. She thought about Gideon not warmly, not charitably, but with something approaching actual thought, which she figured she owed him even after everything. She thought about the man she'd watched carry a dying calf through a January snowstorm because he couldn't stand to see it go, the same man who had told her to let a human being freeze to death outside. She thought about how drought does things to people, how desperation calcifies a person into a version of themselves that they might not have predicted. It didn't change what he'd done, it just made it sadder, which was its own kind of understanding. What happens to him now, she asked. My attorneys completed a foreclosure action this morning, Rowan said. It's been in process for several months. The debt is due and unpayable, and the lender has exercised his right to the property. He paused. I own Iron Creek Ranch as of this morning. She absorbed that. Gideon doesn't know yet, she said. He does by now, Rowan said. My attorneys were to deliver the documents to the ranch house at 9 o'clock. She thought about that image Gideon receiving papers at his own front door on the same morning he'd thrown her out the gate. She thought about what his face would look like. She thought it would be something she wouldn't want to see, not because she felt sorry for him, but because ruin is just ruin, and there's nothing satisfying about it when you're close enough to see the texture of it. The cattle rustling, she said. Will there be charges? That's for the law to decide, Rowan said. My attorneys will provide everything they have to the territorial marshal. What comes after that is not in my hands, and Brock? Rowan glanced at her. He assaulted you on a public road. He'll face what he faces. She nodded slowly. Her knee was aching from hitting the road surface, and she shifted her weight in the saddle to redistribute it. And she felt the locket shift against her chest with the movement, and she reached up and pressed her hand flat against her sternum for a moment, feeling the shape of it through the fabric. Still there, she let her hand drop. They rode for another hour before the outline of Copper Ridge started building against the afternoon sky, first just the water tower, then the blocky shapes of buildings, then the slow accumulation of a town coming into focus through the haze. She'd been to Copper Ridge twice in her life, both times on ranch business with Gideon, and neither time had she had any money in her pocket or any business of her own to attend to. She had money now, actually her final 2 weeks of wages, which Gideon had technically still owed her and had apparently paid in cash into her hand before she walked out, she realized with a cold clarity. Because even Gideon wasn't quite willing to let himself be the kind of man who didn't pay the wages he owed. Small mercy. Wouldn't last long, but it was something. As the town drew closer, Rowan said, There's a hotel on the main street. The alderman. I'd like to pay for a room for you. Don't make that face. Just listen to me, not as charity. Compensation for what happened to you as a direct result of me being on that property, which is a different thing. She started to object. You lost your job, he said. You were fired for helping someone who turned out to be trespassing on a property he now owns, which is arguably on him and not on you. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering what I'd offer anyone in a business dispute where I was the cause of a material loss. She thought about that. One night, she said, however long you need. One night, she repeated, and I'll pay you back for it when I'm working again. He looked at her for a moment. With that expression, she was starting to recognize the one that was assessing something. All right, he said, I mean it. I know you do, he said. That's why I said all right. They came into Copper Ridge in the late afternoon, the riders drawing looks from the people on the boardwalks as they passed, not the kind of looks a group of travelers usually draws, but the specific look that 6 armed riders and a man in an expensive coat will pull in a small frontier town, the look that is calculating something about power and money and the way those things tend to move through a place. Mara ignored the looks. She was thinking. She was thinking about Rowan's story, fitting it against the years she'd spent at Iron Creek Ranch, the things she'd seen and the things she'd chosen not to look at too hard. She was thinking about how many times she'd noticed cattle numbers that didn't quite add up and told herself it was the drought, told herself it was her business to haul water in muck stalls and not to count other people's cattle. She was thinking about the locked pasture on the ranch's east boundary that she'd never been allowed near and had never asked about, because you learned fast on Iron Creek Ranch what questions were welcome and what questions were not. She was thinking about what it meant that she had knelt in the dark beside a man and saved his life, not knowing who he was, not knowing what was coming, not knowing anything except that he was alive and would stop being alive if she walked away. She had not walked away, and now she didn't know what came next. That was the honest truth of it. She was riding into a strange town with a bag that had a broken strap and no job and no plan, and the wages from a position she'd just been fired from. And she was trying to figure out how to feel about a situation that had no precedent in anything her life had prepared her for. They pulled up in front of the Alderman Hotel, a 2-story sandstone building with a covered porch and a hand-lettered sign. Rowan dismounted and spoke quietly to the man at the front, who had come out at the sound of the horses, and there was a brief exchange that she couldn't hear, and then Rowan turned back to her. "Room's yours for as long as you need it," he said. "I said one night. I heard you." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "I'd like you to read something before you make any more decisions. It's not a legal document or an offer of employment or anything like that. It's something I owe you an explanation for." He held it out. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She took it. She didn't unfold it yet. She put it in her bag with the rest of her things, careful, tucking it next to the Bible. "I'll read it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." "What time tomorrow?" she said. "I'll be here as long as needed," he said. "No rush," she nodded once. She turned and walked into the hotel without looking back, and the man at the front showed her up a staircase to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced the main street, and when he left and the door closed behind her, she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her bag on her knees and held on to it with both hands. She sat like that for a long time. The sounds of Copper Ridge came through the window horses, voices, the distant clang of something metallic, the whole ordinary noise of a town going about its business. She listened to it and breathed. Then she opened her bag, took out the folded paper, and started to read. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had learned it as a discipline rather than absorbed it naturally. It was dated from that morning, which told her he'd written it after leaving the ranch, after finding his horses and his men and his clean clothes and his proper sling, and before riding back to find her on the road. She read the first paragraph, then she read it again. Then she sat with the paper in her hands for a very long time, and the sounds of the town continued outside, and the light through the window moved slowly across the floorboards as the afternoon edged toward evening. The paper said, "My father's name was James Mercer. In the winter of 1867, during the worst fighting of the territorial campaign, he was wounded and left behind when his unit was ordered to retreat. Another soldier stayed with him, stayed through the night, protected him and 3 other wounded men until it was safe to move them out. My father survived because of that soldier. He talked about him until the day he died. He said the man had told him that the only test of a person's character was doing the right thing when it cost you something real. That soldier's name was Sergeant Elias Bellamy. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the paper down on the bed beside her, very carefully, as if it were fragile, and she pressed her hand flat over the locket through her shirt. Her grandfather's face. Her grandfather's words, spoken to a wounded man in a winter night, now coming back to her across 20-something years, and however many hundreds of miles, carried in the memory of a man's son, delivered to her on a road in a dust valley by a stranger she'd knelt beside in the dark. She did not cry. She sat very still. The light moved across the floor. Outside, Copper Ridge went about its ordinary business, not knowing and not needing to know what was unfolding in the second-floor room of the Alderman Hotel, where a girl with a broken bag strap and a silver locket was sitting on a bed reading a letter about a grandfather she had loved more than anything in the world and had thought was entirely hers. She had not known he also belonged in some small but permanent way to a stranger's story. She had not known that story would find her. She folded the paper along its original creases. She put it back in her bag. She went to the window and stood looking out at the main street of Copper Ridge in the long, golden, dusty light of late afternoon. Tomorrow, she thought, she would figure out what to do with all of this tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, she had a room and a door she could close, and she was going to sit with what she'd learned until she understood the shape of it. She pressed her hand to the locket one more time. Then she let it go, and turned away from the window, and sat back down on the bed, and started to work through it. She slept better than she had any right to. That was the first thing she noticed when she opened her eyes the next morning, that she had actually slept, deeply and without dreaming, in a way she hadn't managed in longer than she could cleanly remember. Maybe it was the bed, which was softer than the bunkhouse cot she'd been on for 5 years. Maybe it was the door with a lock on it, the first locked door she'd had to herself in her life. Maybe it was just that the body reaches a point where it stops caring about the state of things and simply takes what it needs. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling for a while, listening to Copper Ridge waking up outside. Wagon wheels, someone shouting to someone else across a distance. The smell of coffee and wood smoke coming through the gap at the bottom of the window. Then she sat up, swung her feet to the floor, and started thinking. The letter was still in her bag. She hadn't moved it in the night. She didn't need to read it again. She had read it 4 times the evening before, sitting at the small table near the window with the lamp turned up, reading each line until she had the shape of it memorized. James Mercer, winter of 1867, Sergeant Elias Bellamy. She did not cry reading it the 3rd time or the 4th time either, which told her something about herself she wasn't entirely sure how to interpret. She felt it in the specific way that information lands when it changes the dimensions of something you thought you already understood completely, but the feeling was too large and too complicated to come out as something as simple as tears. Her grandfather had saved a man's life. That man's son had come looking for her. And in the dark beside a water trough, without knowing any of it, she had saved that son's life. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about what that meant, and concluded that she didn't know yet, and that was probably all right. She washed her face at the basin. She put on her second cleanest shirt. She took the locket out and held it for a moment without opening it, just held the weight of it, and then she put it back inside her shirt where it belonged. Then she went downstairs to find Rowan Mercer. He was in the hotel's small dining room, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a spread of papers in front of him that he was reading through with the focused, slightly frowning expression of a man accustomed to having too much information and not enough time. He looked up when she came in, and whatever he read in her face made him set the papers aside without making a thing of it. She sat down across from him. The woman who ran the dining room brought her coffee without being asked, which she appreciated more than she could easily say. You read it, Rowan said. Yes, I should have told you sooner, he said. I want to say that plainly. I had reasons for waiting. I needed to be sure you were who I thought you might be, and I needed to deal with the immediate situation first, but I'm aware that doesn't make the waiting right. Why did you need to be sure? She said. What would it have taken to convince you? Honestly, he turned his coffee cup with his good hand, just turning it, thinking. You'd already convinced me. The moment you knelt down next to me and started working on my arm in the dark, without asking me who I was or what I had, you'd already convinced me. He paused. I waited because I wasn't sure what I was going to say or how to say it, and I didn't want to say it wrong. She looked at him. The letter felt like the right way, he said. Give you time to read it without someone watching your face. That was decent of you, she said, and meant it. He nodded and looked back at his coffee. She wrapped her hands around her own cup and let the heat move into her palms. What happened to your father? She said after. He came home, Rowan said. He had a limp the rest of his life. From that winter the wound didn't heal clean, and there was some nerve damage in his left leg. But he came home. His voice was careful and level, the voice of a man who has told a portion of this story many times, and a portion of it almost never. He went back to work. Built the cattle operation over about 15 years, started with 12 animals and a piece of dry land nobody else wanted. He had my mother, and then had me, and then had my sister Clara. He was a good man. Difficult, sometimes, the way men who've been through hard things can get difficult. But good. Did he know what happened to my grandfather? Mara said. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He tried to find him, he said. After the campaign ended, he made inquiries. The regiment your grandfather served was partially disbanded and partially reassigned, and the records from that period are incomplete is a polite word for it. He found a discharge record with Elias Bellamy's name and a date, and a mailing address in a town about 400 miles from here. But when he wrote to the address, the letter came back. Nobody there by that name. He looked at her. My father spent years feeling like he owed a debt he couldn't repay. It wore on him. He talked about your grandfather in a specific way, not often, not in front of people he didn't trust. But when he did, it was the way you talk about something that has weight in you that hasn't been set down. Mara thought about her grandfather. She thought about what it meant that a man had spent years writing to wrong addresses trying to find him. He died when I was 9, she said, my grandfather. A fever. He was sick for about 3 weeks and then he was gone. I'm sorry. He was 61, she said. He used to say that 61 was a fine age for a man who'd had as many arguments with the world as he'd had. The memory surprised her, coming up clearly and sharp and warm. Funny sometimes. People didn't always expect that. No, Rowan said. From how my father described him, I don't imagine they did. They sat quietly for a moment. Outside the window, Copper Ridge was moving through its morning. A couple of children ran past on the boardwalk. A delivery wagon pulled up to the general store across the street. Tell me what you want, Mara said. Not the explanation, not the history. What you actually want from this conversation. Rowan looked at her steadily. I want to offer you something, he said, and I want to tell you about it honestly and let you decide without any pressure from me. Because the last thing in the world I want is for you to feel like you're being handled. Handled, she repeated, yes. I've been in a position most of my adult life where people assume what I want from them, and they make decisions based on that assumption, and everything gets arranged around what they think I need rather than what's actually being said. I don't want to do that to you. He picked up the coffee cup. Iron Creek Ranch is mine. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it since my attorneys called me to confirm the foreclosure yesterday morning. I wasn't planning to keep it. Necessarily, it's not close to my existing operations. It would need significant work, and the drought has stripped it down pretty hard. The logical thing would be to sell it, but, she said. But it's a good piece of land, he said. The drought won't last forever. The water table is actually not as bad as the surface suggests. My people tell me there are ways to bring it back if someone manages it right. The cattle that remain are in better condition than they should be for how bad things have gotten, which tells me somebody was working very hard to keep them alive. He looked at her. I know that was you. She didn't confirm or deny it. She waited. I want to offer you the ranch, he said. The dining room was very quiet. She heard from the kitchen the sound of something being set on a metal surface. She heard the wagon outside. She was aware of her own breathing. That is not a small statement, she said finally. No, he said, it's not. I'm 17 years old. I know I've never owned anything. I know that, too. Rowan, she put her cup down, I saved your life. I did that because it was right, not because was I angling for something. I don't want you to feel like you owe me a ranch. I don't feel like I owe you a ranch, he said, and his voice was patient but direct. I feel like you are the most capable person I have encountered in this valley, and I have met everyone of consequence in this valley over the past several weeks. I feel like you know that land better than any outside buyer I could find will know it for the next 10 years. And I feel like my father spent a long time unable to repay what your grandfather gave him, and I have the ability to do something about that, and I would like to do it. That's 3 different arguments, she said. Yes, he said. I know. Which one is the real one? He thought about it. Actually thought, not the way people perform thinking to seem considerate, but genuinely. All 3, he said, equally. She looked out the window. She thought about Iron Creek Ranch, not as it was under Gideon, not the fear and the tight budget and the rules that made no sense, and Brock's watching eyes. She thought about the land itself, the east pasture in the early morning when the light hit it at a low angle and the grass, what was left of it, caught the gold of it, and everything looked like it was waiting. The way the creek bed ran even when it was dry, the particular way the water moved when it did run, fast and cold and clear over flat stones. The north fence line she'd repaired 3 times by herself because nobody else would do it, and she couldn't stand to watch the cattle drift through the gaps. The mare who'd been restless the night she found Rowan, and who was, as far as she knew, still in the barn at Iron Creek, still hers to look after even though she had no claim on her and no authority. She thought about what it would be to own it, not work it for someone else. Not earn her keep in the corner of the bunkhouse, own it. Be responsible for it, make every decision about it. The thought was large enough that she couldn't look directly at it. I would need to think, she said. Of course. I need more than a morning. Take whatever you need, and I need to understand exactly what you mean by this offer, she said. Not the general shape of it, the specifics, because I'm not going to walk into something I don't understand, and I'm not going to be in a situation where I'm obligated to you in ways I haven't agreed to. That's fair, he said. Completely fair. He pulled the papers he'd been reading when she came in and organized them into a smaller stack. I had my attorney draw up a basic outline this morning. It is an outline, not a final document. Nothing is final until you agree to it. And you should have your own legal counsel look it over before you sign anything, which I will arrange and pay for if you want. I can't pay a lawyer, I know. The offer stands regardless. She looked at the papers. What does the outline say? She said. Transfer of ownership, clear and complete, no liens, no obligations back to me. Initial operating capital to rebuild the herd to functional numbers and make necessary repairs, structured as a loan against future revenues at below market interest, which means you pay it back out of what the ranch earns, not out of anything you don't have. He paused. There's one condition, and it's minor, and I want to be honest about it. What is it? First right of refusal if you ever choose to sell, he said. Meaning, if you decide in 3 years or 10 years or 20 years that you want to sell the ranch, you offer it to me first before taking it to market. That's it? That's it. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because the Valley Corridor matters to my railroad interests, and I'd rather have the option than not, he said. I'm not going to pretend it's entirely selfless. She almost smiled at that. All right, she said. Leave the papers. I'll read them. Take your time. She picked up the papers and put them in her bag next to the Bible and her grandfather's letter. I need to ask you something else, she said. Go ahead. When we go back to the ranch, she stopped, noticed what she'd said. Noticed he'd noticed too, went on, if we go back. If I decide yes, what does that look like? Gideon is still there. Gideon received notice of the foreclosure yesterday morning, Rowan said. He has been informed that the property must be vacated. However, I haven't sent anyone to enforce that yet, partly because I was attending to other matters, and partly because I thought it should be done with you present, if you decide you want to be. Why with me present? He met her eyes. Because I thought you had a right to be there. The honesty of that landed in her differently than she expected. She had anticipated something more varnished, some version of it, that made it sound more purely strategic than it probably was. The plainness of it caught her off guard. She stood up. I'll have an answer for you by this afternoon, she said. She walked back upstairs, closed her door, sat at the table, and spread the papers out in the light from the window. She read every line. She read the parts she understood and the parts she only half understood, and when she reached a clause she wasn't certain of, she made a small mark beside it and kept going. She had never read a legal document in her life, but she had read enough to understand that words had specific weights and that the weights mattered. And she worked through it the way she'd worked through everything hard in her life, without rushing, without pretending she understood something she didn't, starting over when she lost the thread. At the end of it, she sat back. The terms were what he'd said they were. She'd been watching for places where they might not be, for the hidden hinge, the clause that created an obligation he hadn't mentioned. She didn't find one. She folded the papers, put them back in her bag. She went back downstairs. Rowan was still at the corner table, working through his correspondence. He looked up when she came in and waited. Yes, she said. He nodded once. There's one thing I'm doing before I sign anything, she said. What's that? We go back to the ranch first, she said. I want to see how Gideon handles it. I want to make sure the workers are all right. And then I'll sign. Today, is that a problem? He looked at her for a brief moment. No, he said. I'll have the horses ready in 20 minutes. The ride back to Iron Creek Ranch took 3 hours, and she rode it differently than she'd ridden out that morning, 24 hours earlier, not in her body, which was still sore in the knee and tight across the shoulders, but in the way she held herself in the saddle, the way she watched the road, the way she was thinking. She was thinking about what you owe a place and what a place owes you. She was thinking about the workers, about the men she'd worked alongside for 5 years, some of whom she'd never liked especially, but all of whom had worked hard for wages that were never quite as generous as they should have been under Gideon, and who probably woke up this morning without a clear idea of what the foreclosure meant for their futures. She was thinking about the mare. Rowan rode beside her for most of the journey in silence, which she appreciated. His men flanked them in that same quiet professional way, not intrusive, just present. The weathered older rider, whose name she'd learned was Hale, nodded at her once when she caught his eye, a small nod that communicated something she couldn't entirely decode but felt like respect. They came to the gate of Iron Creek Ranch at midday. She'd walked out this gate that morning with everything she owned in one bag. She came back through it on horseback with the deed to the property in a folder in the saddlebag, not yet signed but very close. The yard was unsettled. She could feel it before she saw the specifics, the particular quality of tension that settles over a place when things are wrong and nobody knows what they're supposed to be doing. 3 of the hands were standing near the bunkhouse, talking in the low, careful way of men discussing something that makes them nervous. One of the older workers, a man named Ott who'd been there longer than anyone, was by the barn with a pitchfork, not using it, just holding it like he needed to have something in his hands. They all looked up when Rowan's party came through the gate. Ott took in the riders, took in Rowan, took in Mara. Expression went through several things in quick succession, and then settled into something careful and watchful. Miss Mara, he said. Ott, she said. Where's Gideon? He jerked his chin toward the main house inside. Been inside since those men came with the papers this morning. Hasn't come out, Brock? Rode back in about an hour after you. He stopped. Recalibrated. After this morning. He's been in the main house, too. She dismounted. She handed her reins to one of Rowan's men without thinking about it, the way you hand reins to someone who's going to hold them, and she walked toward the main house. Behind her, she heard Rowan dismount and his boots hit the ground, and she heard him say something quiet to Hale, but she didn't look back. She knocked on the door of the main house. Gideon opened it. In 24 hours, something had happened to his face. It was the same face, same jaw, same flat eyes, same lines cut into it by weather and years, but the arrangement of it had changed. The certainty was gone. That particular quality that powerful men carry around like a second skin, the absolute settled conviction that the ground beneath their feet is solid and permanent, it was gone. And what was left underneath it looked smaller and older than she'd expected. He looked at her. He looked past her at Rowan and the riders. Then he looked back at her. You brought him here, he said. He brought himself, she said. He owns it. I know what the papers say. Then you know what you need to do. His jaw moved. You going to enjoy this? Being here for this? No, she said, and she meant it. I'm not here to enjoy anything, Gideon. I'm here because there are people on this ranch who need to know what's happening, and I wanted to make sure that conversation went right. Something shifted in his face. He hadn't expected that. The workers, she said. What have you told them? Nothing, he said. I didn't know what to tell them. Then I'll talk to them. He stared at her. You'll talk to them. Yes, you're 17 years old, and you were a hired hand 24 hours ago. Things change, she said. Rowan came up beside her. He didn't step in front of her. He stood alongside her, just slightly back, and he looked at Gideon with an expression that was not angry, and was not triumphant, and was not pitying, which might have been the hardest of all for Gideon to take. Mr. Voss, Rowan said, my attorneys have been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office regarding the cattle situation. You'll be receiving further communication from them within the week. In the meantime, the terms of the foreclosure require that the property be vacated by the current occupant within 48 hours, with the exception of personal possessions. He paused. I'd recommend you use the time well. Gideon said nothing. I'm also asking that Brock Tolland leave the property today, Rowan said. Not in 48 hours. Today, he assaulted a minor on a public road this morning. The law will be making inquiries about that separately. Gideon's eyes moved to Mara. She held his gaze. I didn't tell him to hurt you, Gideon said, and his voice was rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before. The locket thing, I told Brock to ask for it. I didn't tell him to put his hands on you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about whether she believed him. She thought that it was probably true, in the technical sense that Gideon had probably not explicitly ordered Brock to knock her down on the road. And she thought that it was also true that Gideon had created every condition that made Brock the kind of man who would, and that a person was responsible for the things they set in motion, even when they didn't watch them all the way through. She thought about what her grandfather would have said about that. He would have said, knowing the difference between what you did and what you caused doesn't always amount to the difference you think it does. I know, she said finally, but you sent him. Gideon looked away. You can take your personal things, she said. The ranch supplies, the equipment, the remaining cattle, those stay. If there are wages owed to any of the hands, those get paid before you go. Every cent. His head came back up. You're not in any position to. She is, actually. Rowan's voice was quiet and final. The transfer of ownership is being completed today. Miss Bellamy will be managing this property going forward. The silence that came out of Gideon in that moment was different from any silence she'd heard from him in 5 years. It was the silence of a man processing a specific kind of loss, not just a material loss, which was enormous, but the particular loss of having the thing he'd built given to the girl he'd kicked out the gate. She watched it happen, and she didn't look away from it, because she thought he deserved someone to actually witness it without flinching, even if that witnessing was its own kind of hard thing to do. "You have an hour," she said. "I'll speak to the hands." She turned and walked back into the yard. The hands had gathered. Not all of them. There were a few out on the range that she could see, distant figures that would need to be reached separately. But most of them were there, 6 men standing in a loose group near the bunkhouse, looking at her with expressions that ran from wary to openly uncertain. To one face, a young kid named Petey, who'd only been on the ranch 3 months, that was just plain scared. She walked toward them. She stopped a few feet away, and she looked at them. And they looked at her, and she was aware of how this must appear to some of them, the girl from the bunkhouse corner, the one who got fired for tending to a stranger, now standing in the yard with an armed party behind her and something in her posture that hadn't been there the day before. "You've all seen the papers by now," she said, "or heard about them. Iron Creek Ranch is under new ownership as of today. Gideon Voss is leaving." She let that sit for a second. "Nobody's asking any of you to leave. Your wages are current. I'm making sure of that before Gideon goes. And if you want to stay on and work this ranch under new management, you're welcome." "All of you," Ott said. "Who's the management?" "Me," she said. Ott looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan, standing behind and to the side of her. "She's management," Rowan confirmed. "I'm an investor. The decisions are hers." Ott turned his pitchfork so the tines were up and rested the handle against the ground. He looked at Mara. He had 20 years on her at least. He'd been ranching since before she was born. The look on his face was doing several things at once, and she waited for it to resolve. "The east fence needs work," he said finally. "Third post from the creek crossing is rotted through. I've been telling Gideon for 2 months. "I know," she said. "I've been telling him for 3. Something passed across Ott's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. "Expect we can fix a fence post," he said. "Yes," she said. "We can." The front door of the main house opened. Gideon came out. He was carrying a saddlebag that he'd clearly filled in the last 20 minutes. The shape of it was lumpy, and the buckle was fastened wrong. He had on his riding coat and his good hat, the one he kept for town, and the sight of him in his best hat for this particular exit was the thing that almost cracked something in her. Not grief exactly, not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to both that she didn't have a name for. He came down the porch steps. He didn't look at the assembled hands. He looked at Mara. She thought he might say something. She saw it forming, something complicated, something that maybe had an apology somewhere in it or maybe didn't, but was working towards something real. She watched his face working on it. Then Brock came out the door behind him, and Gideon's face closed off. Brock looked at Mara. He looked at her with those small, quick eyes that had always made her feel counted and measured, and she looked back at him without any expression she was particularly trying to manufacture, just looking, and she thought she saw not remorse. Brock was not a man built for remorse, but something that recognized the weight of the morning, the completeness of the reversal. "The marshal's going to want to talk to you," she said to him. "Don't make that harder than it needs to be." He said nothing. He walked past her toward the stable. Gideon stood for another moment in the yard. "You'll run it into the ground inside a year," he said. It wasn't mean exactly. It sounded more like a man trying to convince himself of something. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. But it'll be mine to run either way." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put on his hat and walked toward the stable, and she watched him go. And she thought about the 5 years she'd spent on this land, and all the ways it had been hard, and all the ways it had, somewhere beneath all of that, been home in the only way she'd known home, and she let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took him to disappear into the stable, and then she turned back to the hands. "The mare in the second stall," she said to Ott. "Is she running a fever?" He blinked. "Checked her this morning. She's fine. A little restless still, but no fever. Good." She looked around the yard at the fences that needed work, the barn that needed patching in the north wall, the water trough that needed scrubbing, The whole complicated inventory of things that had been deferred and delayed and left for someone else to deal with for too long. Let's get to work. The hands looked at each other. Then Ott planted his pitchfork back in the ground, gripped the handle, and went back into the barn. One by one, the others followed. Rowan came up beside her. "Papers," he said. "I'll sign them," she said. "Have your attorney come this afternoon. I want it done here, on the ranch." "I can arrange that." She looked at him. "I want you to do one more thing," she said. "What's that?" "When it's done, I want you to tell me everything else your father remembered about my grandfather." Not just what was in the letter, everything. He was quiet for a moment. "I can do that," he said. "It'll take a while, I know," she said. "I want all of it." She turned away from him and looked out across the ranch, the yard, the fences, the dry pastures, the pale hills beyond, the enormous empty sky above all of it, which had not given this valley rain in 3 long years, but which was still, for whatever it was worth, the same sky her grandfather had stood under. She reached up and pressed her hand against the locket through her shirt. Then she dropped her hand and walked toward the barn, and there was work to do, and she went to do it. Rowan's attorney arrived at Iron Creek Ranch at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He came in a hired buggy from Copper Ridge, a compact man named Aldous Fenn with a leather case that he carried like it contained something irreplaceable, which Mara supposed it did. He had the manner of someone who had spent his entire professional life translating between the language of power and the language of ordinary people, and who had gotten good enough at it that he didn't condescend even when he easily could have. He set up at the kitchen table in the main house, which was now technically Mara's kitchen table, a fact that she was still processing in the way you process something that is true but hasn't finished becoming real yet. She sat across from him. Rowan sat to the side, not at the table exactly, more adjacent to it, which she understood as his attempt to make clear that this was her transaction and not his. Fenn walked her through the documents piece by piece. He did not rush. When she asked him to explain something twice, he explained it twice. When she made a mark beside a clause she wanted changed one line about dispute resolution that she felt gave his firm too much procedural influence over any future disagreement, he looked at it, looked at Rowan, looked back at her and said, "That's a fair point. We can revise that." Rowan said nothing. He just nodded. She signed at 4:15 in the afternoon. Fenn witnessed it. Hale, who had come in from the yard when asked, witnessed it too. The whole thing took about 45 minutes and involved more paper than she had expected, and less ceremony than she might have imagined, which felt right. The most important things in life usually happened without ceremony. You knelt in the dirt and wrapped a stranger's arm. You signed your name on a line and the ground under your feet became yours. The world didn't stop moving to mark it. When it was done, Fenn gathered his papers back into his case with the careful efficiency of a man closing a chapter, and he shook her hand, and he shook Rowan's hand, and he said something polite and went back out to his buggy. Mara sat at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the surface of it and felt the grain of the wood under her palms. The table had been in this kitchen for 20 years, probably. She had eaten at this table a handful of times when Gideon had invited the senior hands in for a meal during branding season, sitting at the far end, never quite comfortable. Now her name was on paper saying this table was hers, this kitchen was hers, the whole complicated struggling piece of land outside was hers. "How do you feel?" Rowan said. She thought about it honestly. "Like I owe someone a great deal of money," she said. He almost laughed. Not quite a sound that was adjacent to a laugh, shorter, surprised out of him. "That's accurate," he said. "You do. Me, technically." "I know." She took her hands off the table. "I'm going to pay it back." "I don't doubt it. I mean it. I'm not saying it to say it." "Mara," he looked at her steadily. "I know." She pushed back from the table and stood up. There were things she needed to do before the light went the east fence post Ott had mentioned. The water distribution for the remaining cattle, A conversation with the two hands who hadn't been in the yard for the midday gathering and who she needed to talk to directly. She had been making mental lists all afternoon, items, reorganizing by urgency, the way her mind worked when it was given something real to chew on. She went to the door. Then she stopped. "You said you'd tell me," she said. Everything your father remembered, he hadn't forgotten. She could tell from the way he'd been carrying something in his posture all afternoon, something he was holding until the right moment. He nodded and stood up. "Walk with me," he said. They went outside. The afternoon was cooling toward evening, the quality of the light shifting into that long, golden, horizontal thing that happened in open country when the sun got low, the kind of light that made even dry, struggling land look like it was keeping a secret it might eventually share. They walked out past the barn, past the near pasture fence, toward the flat ground where the land opened up, and you could see a long way in every direction. Rowan's arm was still in its sling, and he walked with his right side held slightly careful, not babying it but aware of it. She matched his pace without thinking about it. "My father used to talk about the night your grandfather stayed behind," Rowan began. "But what most people don't know, what he only ever told me once, when I was about 14, was that your grandfather had a chance to go. The retreat order was clear. Every soldier who could move was supposed to move. Your grandfather could move. He wasn't wounded. There was no obligation on him that was any different from the obligation on every other soldier who walked out of there that night." She listened. "He stayed anyway," Rowan said. "And my father said what stayed with him, his whole life, was not what your grandfather did, which was remarkable enough. It was what he said while he was doing it. He was working through the night, moving the wounded, keeping them warm, keeping them quiet, and he was talking to them. Just talking. And at some point my father asked him why he'd stayed, and your grandfather said," Rowan paused. Not for effect. He paused because he was trying to get it right. He said, "A man who walks away from something he could have stopped carries that with him further than he carries anything else. I'd rather carry the cold." The valley was very quiet. "I'd rather carry the cold," she said. Yes. She thought about her grandfather's hands. She remembered them clearly, large hands, rough on the palms and careful in the fingers, hands that could fix almost anything and never dropped anything breakable. She thought about those hands working in the dark of a winter battlefield, and she thought about her own hands in the dark of a ranch yard, and she thought that some things did come through, generation to generation, not in the blood maybe, but in the particular shape of what a person is willing to carry. "He was afraid," Rowan said. "My father was very clear about that." "Your grandfather was afraid. He told my father that too, at some point in the night. He said, 'I'm scared right down to my boots, and I'm staying anyway, because the being scared doesn't change what needs doing.'" He looked at her sideways. "My father cried telling me that, the only time I ever saw my father cry." Mara didn't say anything for a while. She looked out across the land, her land now, that still strange fact, and she breathed the cooling evening air, and she thought about courage and what it actually was when you got close enough to see it clearly. It wasn't the absence of fear. Everyone knew that, said it, repeated it. But there was something else underneath it she was only now understanding. It wasn't that the fear didn't matter. It was that the thing that needed doing mattered more, and you knew that, and you went anyway. She'd been cold kneeling in that yard. She'd been afraid. Not of Gideon exactly. More afraid of the mathematics of it, the calculation of what she had and what she stood to lose, and what the stranger's life was worth against all of it. She had run those numbers in the few seconds before she knelt down, and they had come out the only way they could come out, because her grandfather had spent years installing in her a particular hierarchy of what counted, and in that hierarchy, a man dying while she stood watching was simply not a thing she could live with afterward. She had not known she was his granddaughter in that moment. She had just been herself. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said. "I've been carrying it for a while, wanting to give it to the right person, They turned and walked back toward the ranch. The next 2 weeks were the hardest she could remember. Not emotionally, she had had harder emotional stretches. The weeks after her grandfather died, the first winter on Iron Creek when she was 12 and hadn't yet learned how to manage the cold and the loneliness at the same time. This was hard in the practical sense, the logistical sense, the sense of being responsible for 10 times more decisions than she had ever been responsible for simultaneously, while also still having to do the physical work that kept the place running. She was up before first light every day, and she was still making lists by lamplight when the hands had long since gone to sleep. Ott turned out to be indispensable. She hadn't expected that exactly. She'd known he was competent. You didn't last 20 years on a working ranch without being competent, but she hadn't known the depth of what he knew or how readily he would share it. Once it became clear that she was actually asking and actually listening, and not just performing the motions of consultation before doing whatever she'd already decided. He knew the water table under the east pasture better than any geological survey. He knew which sections of fence were actually solid under their weathered surfaces, and which were one hard winter away from failing. He knew the cattle individually, by temperament, by production history, in the way that takes years of daily observation. He also knew, she realized within the first few days, which of Gideon's practices had been good and which had been merely habitual. That rotation pattern he used for the south pasture, Ott said one evening, sitting on an upturned bucket in the barn while she checked the mare's legs. Makes sense in a wet year. In a drought like this, it's the wrong call. You're running cattle over ground that hasn't had time to recover, and the soil is compacting, and when the rain eventually does come, it's not going to absorb right. What's the right rotation, she said, he told her. She asked 4 follow-up questions. He answered each one without impatience. How long did you know it was wrong? She asked, finally. He was quiet for a moment. 2 years, he said. You didn't tell Gideon? He looked at her with the measured expression of a man who has learned exactly how much honesty is useful in any given situation. I told him once, he said. He told me he'd been ranching longer than I'd been alive, and I could trust him to make the decisions, or I could find somewhere else to make them. She thought about that. You can tell me, she said. Anything you think I'm getting wrong, you tell me. I won't always agree with you, but I'll always listen to you. And I won't take it personal. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. It was not a dramatic agreement. It was a practical one, which was the kind she was learning to value more than the dramatic kind, because the practical ones actually held. Rowan stayed. That surprised her a little. She had expected him to leave after the papers were signed, had assumed, based on everything he'd said about his railroad interests, and his cattle operation, and his various obligations in the Eastern Territories, that he was a man with too many claims on his time to spend much of it in a drought-struck valley, watching someone learn how to run a ranch. Stayed. And he didn't insert himself into the operation. He sat on the porch in the evenings, and he rode the fence lines occasionally, one-handed, more carefully than she'd have done it. And he ate with the hands without making the hands feel like they were eating with someone who owned them. The hands had mostly sorted out how they felt about the situation within the first 3 days. The key moment, she thought, came on day 2, when young Petey, the scared-looking one who'd been there only 3 months, had made a bad call moving a section of cattle and ended up with a small herd split across 2 pastures it was going to take half a day to consolidate. He came to find her looking like he expected to be fired, his hat in his hands and his eyes pointed at the ground. How'd it happen? She said, he explained. It was an honest explanation. She could tell he wasn't hiding the parts where his own judgment had been poor. He'd made an assumption about a gate latch that turned out to be wrong and hadn't checked it before he moved the animals. Did you know the latch was unreliable? She asked. No, ma'am. Did someone tell you it was? No, ma'am. Then it's a gap in the orientation, she said. I'll write down every gate and fence issue on this property and make sure every hand knows what they're working with. It'll take me a couple evenings. In the meantime, get Ott and consolidate those cattle. It'll be done by noon. He stared at her. Go ahead, she said. He went. Ott, who had been close enough to hear, said nothing. But later that afternoon, the barn, he said. Without preamble, Gideon would have docked his pay. I know, she said, might make him sloppy, going easy on him. Or it might make him careful, she said, because he knows I'm paying attention, and I expect him to figure things out instead of just hiding mistakes. She looked at Ott. Give it a month. Ott gave it a month. Within 2 weeks, Petey was checking every gate latch on the property twice, morning and evening, and he'd identified 3 additional ones with problems before they caused any issues, and he'd reported each one to Mara directly without being asked. She noted that without saying anything about it, because the noting was enough. The east fence post got replaced. The north barn wall got patched, not beautifully. The patch was visible and somewhat irregular, but it was solid and it kept the weather out. The water distribution got reorganized, so the remaining cattle were accessing the best of the remaining water sources on a rotation that Ott had mapped out, and Mara had modified slightly based on her own understanding of how the animals were moving. She moved into the main house. That took some adjustment. Not the physical act of it, she didn't have enough belongings for the physical act to be complicated. But sleeping in the main house, in a real bed in a real room, with a door that locked and windows that faced east so the morning light came in first that required a recalibration she hadn't expected. She lay awake the first 2 nights, not anxious, just alert, her body not yet convinced that it was allowed to rest somewhere, this solid. She put her grandfather's Bible on the windowsill. She put the locket on the bedside table at night, the first time in years she'd taken it off to sleep because she no longer felt like she needed to carry it as insurance. It was safe. She was safe. That was different from how things had been. On the 8th day, Brock Tolland came back. She was in the yard when she heard the horse, and she looked up and felt her body register the specific recognition of a threat before her mind had finished processing what she was seeing. He came through the gate alone, which was either confidence or stupidity, and he pulled up his horse about 20 feet from her and looked down. He looked different. Not Broken Brock was not a man who broke easily but reduced somehow. Like something that had been propping him up from the inside was no longer there. I'm not here for trouble, he said. She waited. The marshal talked to me, he said. 2 days ago in Copper Ridge. I told him what happened. All of it. He shifted in the saddle, and she saw that the movement caused him some discomfort, though she couldn't tell from where. I'm likely looking at a charge for the assault. That's being worked out. All right, she said. I wanted to. He stopped. He looked at the yard, the barn, the fence line, the general geography of a place he'd worked for 8 years. He looked like a man taking inventory of something he'd lost. I wanted you to know I didn't go out there aiming to hurt you the way it went. I know what you were aiming to do, she said. You were aiming to take my grandfather's locket because Gideon told you to. His jaw moved. That's true, he said, and everything else that happened after that is on me. He said it flatly, like something he'd been working toward saying and didn't want to make sound practiced. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I'm just telling you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she owed Brock Tolland, and the answer was nothing. And she thought about what it cost him to ride out here and say what he'd just said, and the answer was probably more than it looked like from the outside. The marshal will handle the legal part, she said. Whatever comes out of that, that's between you and the law. I'm not going to push for more than what's warranted, and I'm not going to try to protect you from what is. He nodded. Are the other hands being looked after? He said. The question surprised her. She let herself show that it did. Yes, she said. Wages are current, work continues. Everyone who wanted to stay is staying. Something in his face shifted. Ott's a good man, he said. He knows that east pasture better than anyone alive. I know, she said. I found that out. Brock looked at her one more time. His face did something complicated, and then it settled. Good luck to you, he said, and she believed he meant it, which was strange, and she stood with that strangeness as she watched him turn his horse and ride back through the gate. Rowan was on the porch. He'd been there for the whole conversation, far enough back that she'd registered his presence without feeling managed by it. He came down the steps now and stood beside her, watching Brock's silhouette get smaller on the road. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, "you handled that well." "I didn't handle it," she said. "I just let him say what he came to say." "That's the handling," Rowan said. She considered that. On the evening of the 11th day, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and Ott's fence maps spread out in front of her, she heard the rain. Not a big sound at first, a tentative sound, the kind of sound that made her think she might be wrong about it. She sat very still and listened, and then it came harder, and she heard it hitting the roof in irregular, building percussion, and she put down her pencil and walked to the front door and opened it. She stood on the porch. The rain was real. Not a drizzle, not a brief evening mist, but actual rain, coming down steady and increasing, and the smell of it hitting dry ground was something she couldn't describe in any way that did it justice. It was the smell of reversal, the smell of something resuming that had been interrupted. She heard from the bunkhouse the sound of the door opening. Ott came out and stood on the bunkhouse porch and looked up at the sky. Petey came out behind him. One by one, the hands emerged from the bunkhouse and stood in the yard and let the rain hit them. Some of them just standing. One of them, she thought it was the older hand named Cress, who almost never said anything holding his hands out in front of him with his palms up. Rowan came out of the main house and stood beside her on the porch. He looked at the rain falling on the dry land. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. There wasn't anything to say that the rain wasn't already saying more plainly. After a while he said, "I'll be leaving in the morning." She had known it was coming. She'd felt it building for a few days, a slight quality of conclusion in the way he moved through the days, something being prepared. "Your business," she said. "Yes, and my attorney says there are things in the Eastern Territories that need my actual presence, not just my correspondence." He paused. "The railroad project through this valley, the survey is being finalized. The route comes through as planned. It will run about 12 miles south of this property." "What does that mean for the ranch?" "It means better access to markets," he said. "Cattle prices improve considerably when you can move animals by rail rather than on the hoof. It won't happen overnight. These things take time. But within a few years, it should change the economics of ranching in this valley significantly." She thought about that. For everyone in the valley? For everyone near the line, yes, including the small operations. The homesteaders, including them. She nodded slowly. "Good," she said, and meant it simply. The rain continued. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "I'll try. When you came here before all of this, before you were hurt, before anything, were you actually looking for me? Specifically? Or was it the ranch that brought you here and everything else that came later?" He was quiet long enough that she knew he was taking it seriously. "Both," he said. "The cattle losses were real and they needed addressing. I would have come to this valley regardless, but..." He stopped. Started again. "I had found Elias Bellamy's discharge record about 2 years ago, going through my father's papers after his death. And the discharge record had a forwarding address that led nowhere, but it also had a notation, a regimental note that mentioned a granddaughter. No name, no location, just the notation." He looked at the rain. "So when the investigation pointed to Red Hollow, and I decided to come personally, yes. Part of why I came as I did quietly, looking at the valley from the ground up, was that I was hoping to find her." "Find me," she said. "Find you," he said. She let that sit. "You could have just asked around," she said. "Small valley." "Someone would have known. Probably," he said. "But I didn't know what I'd find, and I didn't know how you would receive it. Coming in as a wealthy man with a story about your grandfather felt like it could go wrong in a lot of ways. So you came as a drifter instead and almost died. Came as a traveler," he said, and then things escalated. She almost smiled. Almost the rain fell. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she said. Quiet for a moment, more than he said. They stood on the porch for a while longer without talking, watching the rain do what rain does to ground that has been waiting for it, not an immediate transformation. The land didn't suddenly go green before their eyes. It was subtler than that. A darkening of the soil, a releasing of dust, a general sense of something easing that had been held tense for a long time. After a while, she said, "Thank you for what you told me." "About my grandfather, about your father, all of it." "It was yours to know," he said. "I know. But the way you told it, taking your time, getting the words right. That mattered." He nodded. The hands had gone back inside, or most of them had. Ott was still on the bunkhouse porch, she noticed, his lean silhouette visible in the lamplight from the window behind him, looking out at the rain with the expression of a man doing private arithmetic about what this moisture meant for soil conditions and spring grass and the general trajectory of things. "If I run into trouble," she said, "if there's something I can't solve on my own." "Can I send word?" "Yes," he said, immediately and without qualification. "Always. I'm not saying I'll need to, I know you're not. But if I do send word," he said, "I'll come." She nodded. They went inside, separately, and the evening wound down the way evenings do, at the end of a hard stretch of Days the Lamp. The quiet, the sound of rain on the roof, the body slowly releasing the tension it has been running on. She sat at the kitchen table one more time before she went to bed. She opened her grandfather's Bible, not looking for anything specific, just holding it the way she sometimes held the locket for the weight of it, for what it meant. She didn't read. She just sat with her hand on the open pages, and the rain came down outside, and the ranch was quiet. She thought about Gideon, somewhere out in the territory, probably at a cousin's place or a town he thought might give him a fresh start. She thought about what it would take to actually get a fresh start when you were carrying the weight of what you'd done. She didn't wish him well and didn't wish him harm. She just thought about him briefly, as a human fact, and then let the thought go. She thought about Brock, his hands palm up in a way that meant something she wasn't entirely sure how to read. She thought about the marshal and whatever came next in that particular story. She thought about Rowan leaving in the morning. She thought about what it meant that she was not afraid of him leaving, which was different from not caring. She cared. She had come to trust him in a way that had developed slowly and was more solid for being slow. But she was not afraid of what happened when he was gone, because nothing about her ability to do this work depended on him staying. That felt like something important. That felt like the difference between having a friend and needing a keeper. Closed the Bible. She went to the window and looked out at the rain falling on the dark land. The east pasture was invisible in the dark, but she knew it was there, knew the exact contour of it, the low spot near the creek crossing where the water would pool first, the higher ground where the soil was best. She knew where the fence needed work and where it was solid. She knew which cattle were strongest and which needed watching. She knew this land. Closed the window against the rain and went to bed, and the locket was on the bedside table, and her grandfather's Bible was on the windowsill, and outside the rain kept falling on Iron Creek Ranch, on her land, steady and real and long overdue. Rowan left before sunrise. She heard the horses in the yard, the particular sound of men preparing to route quiet and efficient, the clinking of tack, and the low voices of his riders doing their work without being told twice. She lay in bed for a moment listening to it, then got up and dressed in the dark the way she'd always dressed, not thinking about it, hands finding things by habit. She came out onto the porch as he was checking his saddlebag one-handed, his right arm still in its sling but carried easier than it had been a week ago. The rain from the night before had stopped somewhere around midnight, and the ground was dark and damp, and the air had that particular quality that follows rain in dry country, a cleanness that feels almost apologetic. Like the sky finally delivering something it had owed for a long time. He saw her and straightened. "Didn't want to wake you," he said. "I wasn't asleep," she said. He nodded like that was what he'd expected. They stood for a moment in the early dark, the ranch quiet around them, the hands still sleeping in the bunkhouse, the cattle settled in the pastures. She could hear the creek actually hear it, a faint sound she hadn't heard in months. Water moving over stones somewhere in the distance, the rain having found its way into the creek bed and started it running again, even if only a little. "Safe ride," she said. "I'll send word when I reach the eastern office," he said. "Just so you know the lines of communication are open." "You don't have to, I know," he said. "I'd like to." She looked at him in the gray pre-dawn, this man who had arrived as a broken stranger and was leaving as something harder to define, not a friend exactly. Because friend felt too small for what had passed between them, but not anything more complicated either. Something earned and specific, built out of particular moments rather than accumulated time. "The loan repayment," she said. "I'll start the first installment when I move the spring cattle." "You have 18 months before the first payment is due," he said. "That's in the papers." "I know what's in the papers," she said. "I'd rather start early." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "And the first right of refusal," she said. "I want you to know I have no intention of selling this ranch. Ever. So that clause is probably not going to be very useful to you." Something moved across his face that was quieter and more complicated than a smile. "Good," he said. He mounted his horse, managing the reins with his one good hand in that practiced way she'd come to find oddly reassuring. His 6 riders fell in behind him without needing to be told anything. Hale, the weathered older one, nodded at her on his way past. That same small nod as before, and she nodded back. Rowan looked at her one last time from the saddle. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you," he said. She had no answer for that. It was too large and too true and too much for the hour and the dimness and everything still being so new. She just looked at him, and he seemed to understand that looking was all she had, and he turned his horse and rode through the gate. She stood on the porch until the sound of the horses faded. Then she went inside, put a pot on the stove, and started her day. The weeks that followed the rain were the weeks that decided everything. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story told fast. It was the slow kind of deciding, the grinding daily kind, where the accumulation of small choices and small corrections and small pieces of attention either build into something real or they don't. Mara had understood going in that this was how it would work, and she had not allowed herself to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise was how people ended up blindsided by the work that was always going to be there. The rain had been real and it had helped, but one night of rain after 3 years of drought doesn't save a ranch. What it does is stop the bleeding. What it does is buy you a little time and a little grace and a slightly better attitude from the land. And you take what it gives you and you work. She worked. The east pasture rotation that Ott had recommended proved itself within the first 2 weeks. The ground that had been compacted under Gideon's old system started showing different behavior after the rain, not instant recovery. Nothing like that, but a better absorption rate. Water going into the soil instead of running off, which was the difference between moisture that helped and moisture that left. She watched it carefully and adjusted the rotation twice more based on what she saw, which irritated Ott slightly the first time and gained his quiet respect the second time, when his instinct had been wrong and hers had been right. "How'd you know?" he said. "I watched how the cattle chose to move," she said. They were avoiding the southwest section even when the water was there. Animals avoid ground that doesn't feel right under their feet. They knew before we did. Ott looked at her. "Your grandfather teach you that?" he said. It was the first time anyone on the ranch had mentioned her grandfather directly, and the specificity of it caught her slightly off guard. She told the hands the broad outline of things, not everything, but enough, and they'd absorbed it in the way working people absorb complicated information. Practically, without ceremony, moving on. "He taught me to watch animals," she said. "The rest I figured out. The cattle numbers were the most pressing problem." Gideon's rustling operation, or more precisely, the years of systematic theft from Rowan's herds had been discovered and stopped, but the damage to Iron Creek's own remaining herd was substantial. Between the drought attrition and the animals Gideon had sacrificed to his debts, and the general mismanagement of the lean years, they were running at about 40% of what the ranch's pasture could sustainably support. In practical terms, that meant the operation was not going to be profitable in any meaningful way for at least 2 years, possibly 3, depending on market conditions and the weather. She had known this going in. She had looked at Fenn's financial outline and run the numbers herself twice, and the picture was not comfortable, but it was survivable if she managed it right. The loan structure Rowan had arranged gave her operating capital that could be deployed carefully, not lavishly, not in ways that felt good but didn't produce returns, but carefully. Every dollar had to do something specific. She spent 2 evenings writing out a budget. Petey, who had been the scared kid with his hat in his hands and who had become, in 3 weeks, one of the more reliable presences on the ranch, found her at the kitchen table one night on his way back from a late fence check and stopped in the doorway. "You want company," he said, "or should I leave you to it?" "Pull up a chair," she said, without looking up from the numbers. He sat down. He didn't talk. He just sat, which was the right instinct. She didn't need conversation. She needed another human presence in the room to keep her from going too far down into the numbers and losing perspective. After about 20 minutes, he said, "That column there, the feed supplement estimate. I think that's high." She looked at the column. "Why?" "Because I was talking to the rancher over at the Miller place last week when I rode out to check the north boundary. He said the grazing recovery in his south pasture has been faster than he expected after the rain. If our pasture comes back similar, we might not need as much supplement through the winter." She looked at the column. She thought about the east pasture and how it was already showing different behavior. "How much faster?" He said he revised his supplement budget down by about 1/3. She put her pencil down. "You went to the Miller property?" "Just to the boundary line, to check the fence." "Did you introduce yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." "What's his name?" "Tom Miller. He runs about 60 head on the adjoining land." He seemed glad to have someone to talk to. "I think he's been alone out there a while." She thought about that. Tom Miller at the Miller property, 60 head, probably also coming out of a drought year, probably also watching his pastures and doing his own calculations, probably also slightly less isolated after one fence line conversation than he'd been before it. "Next time you check that boundary," she said, "invite him over for coffee." Petey blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Neighbors matter," she said. "Not just the fences between properties. The people on the other side of them." She picked her pencil back up. Petey revised the supplement estimate downward. The marshal's investigation resolved itself in pieces over the following month. The territorial marshal, a methodical man named Greer who had the slow, settled manner of someone who had been doing careful work for a long time and had stopped being in a hurry about it, came to the ranch twice. The first time to gather Mara's formal statement about the morning on the road, which she gave plainly and completely without embellishment or dramatization, and the second time to tell her what the legal situation had resolved to. Gideon Voss had been found at a town called Harlan's Crossing, 2 days' ride to the northeast. He had not resisted when the marshal's deputies came for him, which Greer mentioned in a tone that suggested he found this notable. Gideon was facing charges for the cattle operation, multiple counts, the scope of which the investigation was still working through, and had been taken to the county seat to answer them. The civil side of it, Greer said, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee he was holding in both hands, is mostly between your investor, mister. Mercer's company and the courts. The criminal side is what I'm working. What does criminal side mean for Gideon? She said. Greer looked at her. Depends on a number of things. 14 months of documented theft at the scale we're looking at. It's serious. Could be prison time. Could be a fine he can never pay. Could be both. He paused. I'm not going to make predictions. I'm not asking for predictions, she said. I'm asking what you think. He considered her for a moment. I think a man who was drowning did something bad to try to keep from drowning, and the law is going to take that into account to the degree the law does, and what comes out the other end will be whatever it is. She thought about that, Brock, she said, pled to a reduced charge on the assault. He'll pay a fine and serve 30 days in the county lockup. Greer set his cup down. He cooperated with the investigation fully, gave us information on Gideon's operation that we wouldn't have found as quickly on our own. Brock cooperated, she said. Fully, Greer said. She sat with that for a moment. Brock, who she had always read as Gideon's creature not unintelligent, not without his own code, but fundamentally loyal to the man who employed him. Brock, who had ridden her down on a public road and knocked her into the dirt. Brock, who had come back and said what he came back to say. Thank you for telling me, she said to Greer. You had a right to know, he said. After Greer left, she stood on the porch for a while. She thought about judgment, about how you hold two things about a person the harm they did, and the other things that are also true about them without letting either one cancel the other. Brock had hurt her. That was a fact that didn't get softer. And Brock had cooperated with the law when it mattered, and had come back to say something that cost him, and those were also facts. The world didn't arrange people into simple categories, and she had never found comfort in pretending that it did. Her grandfather hadn't. He'd told her once, near the end of his life, that the most dangerous thing a person could do was decide they had someone fully figured out, because that was the moment you stopped paying attention. She thought about Gideon. She thought about what it meant to lose everything you'd built, whatever the reason you lost it. She thought about him in a county courthouse, answering for things he'd done out of desperation and pride, and the particular blindness that comes from watching something you built crumbling and being unable to accept it. She did not feel sorry for him. But she understood him more completely than she had before, and she thought that understanding, even without forgiveness, was its own kind of necessary thing. You needed to understand how people broke in order to understand how to keep yourself from breaking the same way. You needed to see it clearly. The rains came again in the third week. Not as heavy as the first rain, but steady 3 days of on and off precipitation that went into the ground and stayed there. She could see the pasture changing. Not dramatically, it wasn't like the land went green overnight. But the quality of the dry grass that remained began to look different, less brittle, less defeated, and in the low ground near the creek crossing, she began to see what she thought. Watching carefully for 2 days before saying anything to anyone might be new growth. She went to Ott. Tell me I'm not seeing what I think I'm seeing, she said, standing at the edge of the east pasture. He looked at the ground for a long time. He crouched down and pressed his fingers into the soil and felt what was there. He stood back up. You're seeing it, he said. She exhaled. It's early, he said immediately. Don't order that champagne yet. I don't drink, she said. Then don't order whatever you would order, he said. We've had false recoveries before. The drought is 3 years deep. 1 wet month doesn't fix that. I know, she said. But it's a start. He looked at the pale green edge of new growth at the pasture's low boundary. It's a start, he said. She hired 2 additional hands in the 2nd month. The decision was not easy. It went against her conservative instinct about expenditure, and she had 3 internal arguments with herself before she committed to it. But the scale of what needed doing, and the pace at which it needed doing if they were going to be ready for a spring expansion of the herd, was beyond what 5 people could cover properly. Ott agreed, which settled it. He agreed rarely and never lightly, and when he did, she had learned to trust it. The 2 new hands were brothers named Calhoun Nate, who was 23 and had been working a small homestead operation with their father until their father's health failed, and Ford, who was 20 and had the specific combination of raw strength and actual attention that was rarer than either quality alone. They came recommended by Tom Miller at the neighboring property, which was itself a kind of validation. They were awkward with her authority for the first week. She was younger than both of them, and a woman, and the owner, and those three facts combined into something that required adjustment on everyone's part. She didn't address it directly, which would have made it worse. She just worked, and made decisions, and explained her reasoning when asked, and sometimes when not asked. And on the 8th day, Nate came to her with a suggestion about the north fence routing that was actually good. And she told him so and implemented it, and after that things were easier. Key to authority, she was learning, was not the authority itself. It was consistency. People needed to know that what you said would be what you did, and that your judgment was worth the trust it asked for, and that the earning was ongoing. You didn't earn it once, and then own it permanently. You had to keep being the person who warranted it. Her grandfather had told her something like that once, phrased differently. He'd said, "A leader is just someone who keeps choosing to stand up one more time than they sit down, and does it where other people can see them." She thought about that a lot in those early months. She wrote to Rowan in the 4th week, not about business. Finn handled the business correspondence, which was minimal and orderly. She wrote personally, on paper she'd bought in Copper Ridge on a supply run, sitting at the kitchen table at night with the lamp burning. She wrote about the new growth in the east pasture. She wrote about the Calhoun brothers and how Ott had reacted to them with a wariness that was already softening into a cautious respect. She wrote about the mare who had fully recovered from her restlessness and was one of the better working horses on the property, willing and forward and honest in a way that Mara had always appreciated in an animal. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you told me, about my grandfather saying he'd rather carry the cold than walk away. I have been carrying that, not as a burden, more like a tool I keep finding uses for. It seems to apply to a lot of things that come up in a day." She paused. She wrote, "I hope your arm is healing. I hope the railroad business is going the way you need it to. Thank you for everything. That is both simple and insufficient, and I can't find words that are better, so those are the ones I'll use." She signed it with her name, just her name, Mara Bellamy. She sealed it and put it with the next dispatch to Copper Ridge. He wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was longer than she'd expected. 2 pages in the same careful, formal handwriting as before, covering the state of his arm, which was healing better than his doctor had predicted, and the railroad survey, which had confirmed the southern route through the Valley Corridor, and several other things about the eastern operation that she read carefully because they were connected, in ways both direct and indirect, to the financial future of her valley. At the end of it, he wrote, "My father used to say that there are debts you repay with money and debts you repay with the life you live afterward. He was in debt to your grandfather until the day he died. I believe now that debt has been settled not by anything I did, but by the particular person you already were before any of this started. I am glad to have found you, Mara. I am glad my father's stories found somewhere to land." She read that paragraph 4 times. She folded the letter and put it in the Bible with the first letter, the one about her grandfather and the winter battle. She had a small collection now. She realized 2 letters and a man's whole story carried inside them. It was not nothing. It was in some ways more than she'd expected to have. The first spring after Gideon was a hard spring by any objective measure. The rains continued inconsistently better than the 3 drought years, but not what the land truly needed to fully recover. The early herd expansion she'd planned had to be revised downward twice, based on what the pasture could actually support, which was a conservative calculation she made against her own desire to move faster. Because moving faster and overcommitting the land would have undone the early recovery work and cost her more in the long run than the patience cost her now. She was patient. Not naturally, she was not a naturally patient person, and anyone who worked alongside her knew it. She moved fast and thought fast and wanted things done and had to consciously slow herself down when slowing down was what the situation required. Ott called her on it twice. Directly, in the flat tone of a man who knew she could fire him and was saying the thing anyway, which was one of the most useful things anyone did for her in that entire first year. The second call-out happened in the early spring, when she wanted to move a section of cattle into the north pasture before Ott thought the grass was established enough to sustain them. 2 more weeks, he said. The south pasture is at capacity, she said. 2 more weeks, he said again, in exactly the same tone. She looked at the north pasture. She looked at the cattle in the south. She looked at Ott, who was looking at her with the steady, immovable patience of someone who had watched ranches make the same mistake in the same season for 20 years. 2 weeks, she said. She waited 2 weeks. The north pasture sustained the cattle without a problem. She did not thank Ott for being right, because that would have implied she doubted him in a way she wanted to pretend she hadn't. But she did. That evening, ask him to walk the west boundary with her and tell her what he saw, and she listened to everything he said without interrupting. And when they were done, she said, I want to have these conversations every week. Both pastures, both boundaries, whatever you're observing. I want all of it. He looked at her. You're not the easiest person to tell things to, he said. I know, she said. Tell me anyway, he nodded. Every week then. The summer brought heat, as summer always did, but the previous fall's rain had changed the ground's capacity to hold it, and the cattle moved through the season better than they had in years, and the early growth in the east pasture held. By the end of summer, she was running 70 head, still below sustainable capacity, still below profitability in the way she needed to reach it, but moving in the right direction, and moving there without pushing the land past what it could give. Tom Miller came for coffee. He came twice in the summer, and by the second visit he'd brought his older sister, Eleanor, who ran the books for his operation and who sat at Mara's kitchen table and looked at the financial framework Fenn had set up and said, with the directness of a woman who had been dealing with numbers her whole life, this loan structure is unusually fair. Who negotiated it? I did, Mara said, with some guidance. Eleanor looked at her. How old are you? 18, Mara said. As of last month. Eleanor Miller looked at her, the way people sometimes looked at her, with that particular recalibration that happened when what they'd assumed didn't match what they were seeing. Then she said, Tom tells me you're planning to expand the herd again in fall. If the pasture numbers support it. We've got 12 animals we've been looking to move before winter, Eleanor said. Good cattle, healthy, just more than we can sustain on our current pasture through the cold months. If you can take them at a fair price, it helps us, and it helps your numbers. Mara thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. What's your price? She said. They negotiated for 20 minutes. The final number was fair to both of them, which was the only kind of deal Mara was willing to make, and they shook hands on it at the kitchen table, with the afternoon sun coming through the window. And Mara thought about what her grandfather had said about doing right by the people around you, not because it was soft, but because the alternative, the grinding, isolated everybody, for themselves version of things, was how you ended up like Gideon, cutting corners in the dark until the corners were all you had left. She made other deals. Some worked and some didn't. One arrangement she made with a supply merchant in Copper Ridge turned out badly when the merchant's reliability proved less than his word, and she had to spend 2 days finding alternative supply lines and one uncomfortable afternoon telling the hands that the order they'd been expecting wasn't coming and they'd have to make do with what was on hand. She handled that conversation badly too abrupt, not enough explanation, and she knew it, and she went back to Ott that evening and said so. I could have told them more, she said. Yes, he said. I didn't because I was frustrated. Yes, he said. I'll fix it in the morning. Yes, he said. She fixed it in the morning. She sat down with the full crew, and she explained the situation plainly, what had happened, what it meant practically, what she was doing about it, and what she expected to need from each of them while the alternative supplies were being arranged. It took 20 minutes. When it was done, the hands went back to work, and the atmosphere in the yard was different, not fixed, not cheerful, but settled. People can work through hard situations if they understand them. What they can't work through is being kept in the dark and expected to trust anyway. She filed that lesson in the place where she was keeping the other lessons. The file was getting thick. 18 months after she signed the papers at the kitchen table, she sent the first loan repayment to Fenn's office. It was not the full amount she'd wanted it to be. The summer had required a repair to the main barn roof that had eaten further into the operating budget than planned. And she'd had to make a choice between the repair and the repayment amount, but it was more than the minimum the loan terms required. And it came with a letter to Fenn noting the amount and requesting a revised repayment schedule that accelerated the remaining payments by 4 months. Fenn wrote back to confirm the payment received and note that Mr. Mercer had asked him to pass along that he was, as Fenn put it in his careful legal language, gratified to hear from her and pleased with the progress reflected in the payment. She smiled at that. She wrote Rowan directly. The first payment went to Fenn. I'm aware it's ahead of schedule. I told you I would be. There will be more to discuss when your railroad business brings you through the valley. If it does, you're welcome here when it does. His reply came 6 weeks later. It was shorter than usual. She could tell he'd written it quickly, in the margins of a busy stretch. He wrote, "The survey is finalized. Groundbreaking for the southern route is planned for next spring. I will be in the valley for that. I look forward to it." She put the letter with the others. The fall came. She stood on the porch one October evening and looked at the land in the long, light way she'd gotten into the habit of doing, at the end of the day not reviewing tasks, not planning, just looking, which was something she'd had to teach herself to do because her instinct was always to be doing something, and she'd come to understand that looking was also a form of doing when the thing you were looking at was your own responsibility. The pastures were not recovered, not fully, not yet. 2 more good rain years would be needed, maybe 3, before the land was back to what it should be. The herd was at 85 head and healthy, which was an improvement she could feel in the daily rhythms of the operation. The hands were settled. Petey had taken on an informal mentorship of the Calhoun brothers that nobody had asked him to take on, and was better at it than she might have predicted for a 20-year-old who'd been scared out of his boots 4 months ago. Ott had replaced the last of the rotted fence posts in the east boundary, and had done it correctly, without drama, and had reported it to her over evening coffee like it was an item crossed off a list, which was exactly what it was. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table. She opened her grandfather's Bible to no page in particular, just held it, the way she sometimes still did when the day had been too much, and the evening required something that wasn't words. She thought about choices. She thought about the specific texture of a choice made in the dark, under pressure, when you can't see what it will cost or what it will lead to. She thought about kneeling in frozen dirt beside a stranger and wrapping his arm and giving him her water, not knowing that he was rich, not knowing that his father had known her grandfather, not knowing anything except that a man was dying, and she was there and she had 2 hands and a piece of cloth, and that was enough to start with. That was the thing about choices made from principle rather than calculation you couldn't know, going in, what they would cost or what they would open. You could only know whether the choice was right in itself, in the moment you were standing in, with the person in front of you, and the thing you knew was true about what mattered. Her grandfather had stayed behind on a winter battlefield, not because he knew James Mercer would survive and build a fortune and have a son who would one day find his granddaughter in a drought valley. He stayed because there were wounded men who couldn't move, and leaving them was not something he was able to do. That was the whole reason. The rest was what life made of it afterward, which was not something he controlled and not something he'd been thinking about when he made his decision. She had not been thinking about any of it when she knelt in the yard. She had been thinking, this man is dying. I have 2 hands. That's enough. The simplicity of it still moved her when she thought about it clearly. Not the outcome. The outcomes were complicated and ongoing and not finished yet, would probably never be finished in any clean sense. But the moment itself, the uncomplicated understanding, in the cold and the dark of what was required. She closed the Bible. She went to the window. The land was dark out there, but she knew the shape of it, knew every field and fence line and low spot and high ground the way you know something you have walked every day in every season and every kind of weather. The north boundary where Petey checked the gates morning and evening. The east pasture where the grass was coming back slower than she'd hoped and faster than aught had predicted. Creek bed running again with real water now, not just memory. The barn where the mare stood in the second stall and would, if you went to her quietly at this hour, rest her forehead against your hand and breathe. She thought about what her grandfather would make of all of it. She didn't know. She couldn't know. He'd been dead for 9 years, and she'd been 12 years old the last time she'd heard his voice, and memory does things to people that aren't always accurate. She knew the version of him that she carried, which was shaped by 9 years of childhood and however many years of afterward. She didn't know the man who had stayed behind in a winter battle. She knew the man who had taught her to watch animals and mend fences and tell the truth even when it cost something, and she suspected those were the same person, but she couldn't be certain. What she was certain of was that she heard him, still. Not literally. But in the moment of a decision, when something in her knew what was right, and she was trying to find a reason not to do it, she heard something that was made of everything he'd said, and everything he'd done, and everything he'd shown her. And it asked the same question every time. What are you willing to carry? She pressed her hand against the locket through her shirt. Then she let it go. She went to the front door and opened it, and the night air came in cool and carrying the faint smell of the creek, real water in a real creek bed, which still felt like something close to a miracle, even though she didn't need miracles to explain it. Just rain and ground that was learning to hold it again, and work done carefully enough to give the ground a chance. She stood in the doorway for a while. Behind her, the lamp was burning on the kitchen table, and her grandfather's Bible was where she'd left it, and the letter from Rowan was in its place inside the front cover, with the first letter. Both of them carried now across all the miles they'd traveled. Ahead of her was the land in the dark, all of it hers, the problems and the promise of it, the fence that still needed work in the southwest corner, the cattle settling into their night patterns in the pastures, the creek running quiet in the dark, the whole ongoing complicated living thing of it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she stepped back inside, left the door open behind her, to let the night air continue to come in, and sat back down at the table with her pencil and the week's list of what needed doing. There was always more. That was the truth of it, not a discouraging truth, just an accurate one. There was always more to do on a piece of land that was trying to come back to life. There was always the next fence post, and the next rotation, and the next calculation about what the land could give, and what you needed to ask of it, and whether those two things could be brought into alignment. She picked up her pencil. She started the list. She was 18 years old, and the land was hers, and the work was real. And outside the door the night was wide and dark, and the creek was running. And somewhere inside the house, on the windowsill where she'd put it, was her grandfather's Bible carrying 2 letters about a debt between families that had taken a generation to find its way home. She wrote down, Southwest Fence, Tom Miller Coffee Thursday, Herd Count Friday, Wright Rowan. She looked at that last item. She wrote, Tell him the land is coming back. Underlined it once. Then she put her head down and got to work, the lamp burning steady beside her, the door open to the night, the creek running somewhere in the dark beyond the window, the land breathing in the quiet way that land breathes when it has been given a reason to.